One of those boomers who elevated freak into a compliment and turned party into a verb.
I was more worried about the mindless.
Chest, noun that taught me scar. Raised stripe where a breast had been.
This pitcher was the strikeout king of the league. People weren't supposed to hit home runs off of him, let alone me. I was not necessarily a long ball hitter.
I suppose the earliest indication that I might be a writer occurred when I was 7 or 8 years old. I had a big chief tablet and a pencil, and I would get on the floor and I would write these imaginative stories. But I don't think that occurred very long. I mean, I got off into a world of athletics, as I said, because I liked them, because my father was a coach. And so by the time I began writing seriously, I was 34, 35 years old. And up to that time, I either was not interested in writing by virtue of being involved in other things, or I was working on a PhD and teaching far more classes in English departments than English professors teach now. So I didn't have any time to write. And then all of a sudden, after I received the PhD and my load became considerably less, I discovered that I could write the draft of a poem between classes and then go off to teach and then come back between classes and revise what I had written. So I never ever written very long poems. I've always been very short. The first poem that I wrote that I felt really good about was a poem called Funeral at Annesley. And the poem's been anthologized, I would guess, a half a dozen or maybe 8 times. It's a poem that I can go back to now, and I would not want to change a word in the poem. It was also a poem which indicated to me that writers have hidden heads, and that much of what we call good writing comes out of our hidden heads. So I would describe the hidden head this way. I wrote the poem, which was about the death of my grandmother, approximately 10 years after she died. And one time when my father and I were hunting pheasants north of Lexington, I said to him, "We're fairly close to Annesley, where your mother and my grandmother is buried. Let's swing in and visit the cemetery, visit her gravesite." And so he was somewhat perplexed, and he said, "Well, why do you want to do this?" And I said, "Because I want to see whether the things that I put in this poem, Funeral for Annesley, are actually there, or whether I made them up. And if so, which ones are the ones that are imaginatively added and which ones are the ones that actually exist." So we pulled in there, and since it was late October, there were some of the things that had been there that weren't there anymore because the birds had migrated and some of the vegetation had been killed by frost. But there was enough there to indicate to me that everything that I put in that poem had been there at the time that my grandmother died. So I had not consciously tried to put those things into the poem. They had simply come out of my hidden head and got into the poem in what I thought at the time was a very mysterious and amazing way, and I have since discovered that it isn't mysterious or amazing at all. That's the way writers write, and sometimes when they are writing well, they're given this as a kind of gift. Well, at my age, I can get turned on by almost anything I look at if I find it fascinating enough. Most of my life I have tried to take the ordinary and make it extraordinary, try to make the common and make it uncommon. So my walking through the world as a writer does not necessitate my looking at something that I find very, very fascinating. I can find almost anything fascinating. And once I do, what I try to do is word my way into that thing and then word my way out. And so some of the poems that I like the best are poems about very commonplace objects that most people would not consider to be worthy of being in a poem. My best way of working is, I write in the morning and I revise in the afternoon. I've always been a morning person. I don't do very much writing at night, although as I said earlier, before this interview began, that I remember many nights of writing in the margins of students' essays at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. And so I wrote that way at night, but I've never really written much poetry at night. I owe a great deal to, many people. I've written poems about my father. My father and I were very close primarily because he was a hunter and a coach. But I've written poems about my mother's side of the family because they were the book readers and the musicians. I feel very fortunate in that I was able to marry those two worlds into my interests. I would hope that those two worlds would also be seen in the poems that I write. So I feel very grateful, in a sense, for the fact that I was able to grow up in an outdoors, hunting, athletic world, but simultaneously in a book-reading, musical world. And it doesn't seem to me to be odd at all to bring those two things together, let's say, in one poem. Well, the first thing I would say to them is that if they're beginning writers, read 10 poems for every one you write. And I don't mean read only contemporary poems. I mean go way back and begin reading poetry in English from fore to aft. One of the things I also feel very grateful about is that when I began teaching, they asked me to teach English and American literature from their beginnings to their ends. As a result of that, the state of Nebraska paid me to be a student for 40 years. I can't imagine how I could have concluded that I was an English major at age 21, that I knew English and American literature. Even after 40 years, I'm not sure that I really know it that well. But what teaching poetry from Beowulf to Seamus Heaney, or from someone like Anne Bradstreet to someone like Ted Kooser gave me was an idea of what a good poem was over the long haul, the very longest hauls in English and American literature. And that's what I would advise any writer, any young writer. Don't just read what is contemporary and fashionable. Read the best that the tradition has to offer you. I do have a couple of new things that one has already come out and one is being printed right now. These are two little books that I have written the poems for, and then my wife designs the books and puts them together, because neither one of the books would sell. I mean, like 2 or 3 copies. We just went ahead and designed them, wrote the poems for them, and printed them. The first one is a book called The Lives of the Prepositions, and I've brought a copy to give to you tonight. And what it does is simply personify prepositions. Now, it sounds like a really odd thing, and it sounded odd to me too when I first considered it. But the longer I thought about it, I thought about little words like of and in and for being very similar to all the ordinary Joes and Janes in the world who never ever get the recognition that the nouns and the verbs get. So I wanted to give them lives, and I decided there are lives of prepositions. So I wrote a little book called The Lives of the Prepositions. Now, if that weren't bad enough, the next one that is being printed right now is called A Matter of Conjunctions. And so I went in and I found but and however and, and subordinating conjunctions like if and since. And I gave them lives too. And so I'll leave it up to the readers whether those things are A, bizarre, or just B, failures, or whether there may be 1 or 2 little ones in there that will keep its heads up, keep their heads up above the others. But that's about as much as I can pull poems down to. I don't know what you call those things. It's kind of like Occidental haiku. Was a fellow at Kearney by the name of C.T. Ryan. His name is on the library now, and he was an absolutely impeccably dressed American Englishman. He wore a vest. He wore spats on his shoes. But he said to us, you have to take great care with the English language. And so even up to the time that we were seniors in college, he was asking us the difference between accept and accept and things like that. And he drilled us. And so that when we got out of college, we may not have been able to write a sentence which made much sense, but we wrote it well. It was grammatically correct. And I really do. I honor him not only for what he did for me, but every day I think I remember some little mnemonic device that he had for remembering the difference between words like that. I've been a pigeon nut for years. My family 20-some years ago gave me a black sweatshirt with great big gaudy gold lettering. It was Gothic lettering. It said strictly for the birds on the front of it, and they were right. When I was 8 or 9 years old, I got to see 3,000 pigeons go up at the railway depot in Columbus, Nebraska for a 500-mile race from Columbus, Nebraska back to Chicago. And there was something about that triggered a lifelong love of birds, especially all kinds of birds, but specifically homing pigeons. And I got some of those pigeons eventually. I also got to know some guys on the south side of Columbus who were second generation Eastern Europeans. They had settled, their fathers had settled in Columbus, and they had brought with them exotic pigeons from Eastern Europe. And as a kid, 8, 9 years old, I used to go down to their places and hang on the chicken wires of the pigeon pens, and they'd have to kick me out and send me home. One of them, Anton Warlowski, introduced me to homemade wine and homemade bread. And so as a 9-year-old, I'd come home to my mother, who was a WCTUer, and she'd say, "Don, what's that I smell on your breath?" And I would say, "Mom, that's pigeons." Those are pigeons, but it was really good wine, you know.
Good evening. My name is Robin Thompson, and I'm the curator here at the Heritage Room. And I'd like to thank you all for braving the elements to come hear Don read tonight. The room that you're in, its official title is the Jane Popgeski Heritage Room of Nebraska Authors, and it's a special collection that's dedicated to preserving and promoting works by Nebraska authors. Currently, we have over 12,000 items in our collection by over 3,000 Nebraska authors. You are all more than welcome to come visit our room during our regular public service hours, which are Tuesday through Friday, noon to 3, and Sunday 2 to 5. We would like to thank the Nebraska Literary Heritage Association because we're only able to bring you special programs like this through an endowment established through their volunteer efforts. Tonight, our reader will be Don Welch. He was also our very first series reader back in April of 1984. Don is a former high school coach who has spent many years as a poet in residence in the Nebraska school system. He's the author of numerous collections of poetry, including Dead Horse Table and Inklings, Poems Old and New. His work has earned much praise and many awards, from the Pablo Neruda Prize for Poetry to the Sower Award in the Humanities. A longtime admirer of pigeons, Welch once noted, "The two big P's in my life are pigeons and poetry." Please help me welcome Don Welch.
Well, thank you for coming. It's always good to see old faces as well as new ones, and this is a really, really fine place in which to read. I mean, when you've got pictures of Willa Cather and John Neihart, and then you can look out at Twyla Hansen and Bill Clefcorn and Marge Sizer and a whole bunch of other people who are writers. You can't ask for any better venue to read poems and to talk about poems than this. When Robin told me that I was the first reader in this series, I think my first thought was, how the heck did this series ever survive the first reading? But I'm pleased to see that it has, and it's gone on for so many years. I'm going to read poems primarily from an unpublished manuscript tonight, and then finish with two poems which are very different from most of the ones that I'm going to read. A few years ago, I came out with a book of poems called The Alley Poems. I'd had a heart attack, and my cardiologist told me to begin walking. And so I'd always been a runner, and walking was really, really boring. And then I discovered that if I took a little pocket notebook and I wrote while I walked, first of all, that pleased Marcia, because I've been known to write while I drive. And she said, you know, writing while you walk is a lot better than writing while driving. But I discovered very quickly that I had run most of the streets of Kearney. And so I decided one day, for one reason or another, to begin walking the alleys. And then I developed, quite unconsciously, a route that went from my place on 27th Street in Kearney out to the edge of town, where there is the Prince of Peace Church, and then I would circle around, and then I would come all the way back, and it's about a 5-mile walk, round trip. But I discovered the alleys were fascinating places, and so after putting a few of these poems in the book called The Alley Poems, I've come back with a book which is about the same size and length, and it's called Gutter Flowers. So here are these little poems. One of the things about writing in a pocket notebook is that you're either pithy or not. And when you're not pithy, well, you can just kind of tear up the page and shove it in your pocket. But when you're pithy, well, you get home and you say, wow, I mean, that's got a lot of pith to it. And so here they are, and they're all very, very short. The first one is called While Leaning Against a Garbage Can Behind the Prince of Peace Church. Now, one of the things about short poems is you have to load up the titles. Yeah, while leaning against a garbage can behind the Prince of Peace Church. It's Tuesday. The ordinary kingdom has come. Again, the usual is spiritual. So I pick a number, like one. One garbage man walking along, a bush green with the sun, a church and its shadow and love. And leaning against a garbage can, I keep looking at one, going in through its intricate oval, finding it more than its sum. August evenings. Evenings when men who work in packing plants escape into alleys with long silences and the crowns of weeds. Hanging over fences, they smoke, the ghosts of their lungs drifting over the scents of marigolds and the empty wallets of last year's seeds. What reconciles any hard place to itself are its dreams, like those evenings in which the last light on the gravel gleams. Alley poet. Like an old dog pulling a hamburger wrapper through a fence, he's learned to read the taste of smells. And boy, were there smells in those alleys. They clashed, they warred against each other at times. I can remember that one woman grew remarkably beautiful cannas. I mean, these things were huge. They towered over me. And right next door, there was a family that decided to carpet their whole backyard with disposable diapers. No, I'm not kidding. I mean, every conceivable inch of that backyard was filled with disposable diapers. They just stood on the back porch and they just threw those things out there. You know, and I could make it worse. I could tell you about the guy who was working on his broken down Buick while trying to lie on his back in that backyard and scoot himself under the Buick. It was enough to turn anybody's stomach. But I tried to write about it. It didn't work. It didn't work. Yeah, there was something in that particular scene that overpowered the poem. Yeah. Advent. This morning, two new parents have pulled up in a driveway of mud. The driver's door with its pane of cellophane swinging open, the driver himself slouching toward the house, a cigarette in his mouth, while the woman kicking open her door carries in a single green blanket something unseen. Hurt, cut, she takes each step a foot at a time. The air is already lonely. After the abuse, like fog, something is always mothering the willows, and on the nerve ends of the locusts growing pure tears. Here's the title poem, Gutter Flowers. I walked past an asphalt street or down an asphalt street to get to some of the alleys that I walked. And because the asphalt street was a street in which there was so much trash in the gutters, there was nothing unusual about that in that part of town. However, there was something amazing growing in the gutters. Now, Twilight, I've got to take you on a walk down that asphalt street because you can give me the technical name for this tiny little flower that was growing up in the cracks of the asphalt, something like a poppy mallow or, just a little bitty white flower that was a chalice of a thing. It was so delicate and so sensitive. And so, I was struck immediately by the fact that in all this trash and in all this neglect, here could come a little bitty flower coming out of what you would consider to be no fertile ground at all. So here's gutter flowers. They flower, and flower for someone, just by flowering. In the cracks of the curbs, among the butts and condoms, they are the future chaliced in the present, a case of a mood spun white. Thistles in the sun, where heat waves wave like old Ophelias, or run. Old couple, porch scene. Why isn't the light lingering in the cathedral of the sun, one hand reaching for another in the name of love? Song for the new baby in the arms of her back porch mother. And see, there's another one of those titles that, probably is a whole poem in itself, Song for the new baby in the arms of her back porch mother. You have gone into sleep, the hands of your grandmothers pulling you on, into the other world where the doves of the sun flutter away every cloud which is dark. But as hawks are already gathering in flocks, ready to turn and stoop on your innocent axis, better the crook of an arm, better the living pillow of love, your mother's warm without harm. The greeting of a Hispanic man lying in a hammock on a cold day. Hey. Would you like that again? The greeting of a Hispanic man lying in a hammock on a cold day. Hey. That was probably the most lifeless greeting I've ever received, but the guy was relaxed. he was very relaxed. And here is one of my favorites. This woman was 70, and she became one of my great alley loves, because it didn't make any difference whether I'd walked past her house on Tuesday, and here it was Thursday. She always came out, seeing me walk down the alley, and she always asked me the same thing. Need aluminum cans? And no matter how often I told her no, that she should keep her own cans and sell them, she was determined to give me any aluminum cans that she could find in her garbage. And so here is my lady of the alley, sagging. She struggles from the back door to the alley, her flesh hanging upon her like a girdle, the stays of which are lost. Need aluminum cans, she asks. I smile, watching her go through her garbage with scarred palms. My lady of the alley, toothless, full of alms. To get to the alleys in southeast Kearney, I had to pass through Collins Park. And one day when I was walking in August and it was particularly hot, I'd stopped in the park to get a drink of water, and then I'd taken up my walk again, and as I came near the ball diamond, I discovered there was a group of kids playing baseball. Since I hadn't found anything really to write about that day, I decided I'd just go out and sit down in the stands and watch kids play baseball. The first thing that surprised me, being an old coach and a follower of current athletics, was that there were no adults coaching the kids. I didn't think kids ever played baseball without adult supervision anymore. I didn't think that the adults could risk it. Yeah. I mean, every one of those 6-year-old kids, if you're going to get a scholarship in college, had to have an adult there to tell him what to do. But these kids had fathers who were too busy, like our fathers were. They were off to work someplace. And so here they were, playing a game of kids' baseball. But I discovered very, very quickly that even if the adults weren't present, their influence was there by bushels, by tons. Pickup game in the park. In the late afternoon, a lefty pitches the ball 5 feet outside the plate, and the outfielders let go with a cacophony of profanity. As he pitches again, the ball right over the batter swinging 2 feet above the ball, the outfielders turn their fingers into adult obscene. It's baseball time for 7-year-olds. Where hours are supposed to be minutes but are really days, and everyone's frozen into position. As the pitcher kicks a wound into the mound and the catcher becomes a crab behind the plate, an outfielder chases a butterfly toward a fence which says optimist. It's August and the game is running late. Yeah. Now that one took up 2 pages in the notebook. Yeah, that's a 2-pager. I took a little poetic license with this next poem. I wasn't walking through the park at midnight. I was only walking kind of late in the evening. Hard kids. Get under the dirt on their faces and you'll find wounds almost scarred shut, or mouths from which joys occasionally bleed out. Right now it's midnight, and they're riding their bikes down the slides in the park. Metal, knifing metal, incisions in the dark. And I wish I'd made this up, but this is a true story. Everything in the poem happened just the way that I wrote it down. The only thing that I did was I introduced the implied animal metaphor, but all the details in the poem are as they occurred on the playground. The whites have turned their backs on the black, their heads cocked over their shoulders, their lips pulled back, their mouths open full of yellow teeth. It's recess, and as the dominant male twirls a football in his hand and laughs, 2 girls with golden manes break into smiles. Hates a look, a feint, a stench. The teacher on the playground does her nails. You know what chalk drawings on sidewalks are? Everybody knows, right? Yeah. If we had some really young people, they probably wouldn't, but this group would know what chalk drawings on sidewalks. I came upon some chalk drawings one day, and have you ever seen how difficult it is to make chalk drawings on a brick sidewalk? It is really tough, but this was a brick sidewalk, and there was broken glass all over it, and cigarette butts, and Lord knows what. But here were signs of a birthday party. Yeah, and each of the birthday guests had taken her turn in drawing her image on a brick sidewalk. Signs of a birthday party. On a broken walk in a graveled part of town, there was a form and name for every guest. Emma, in purple chalk with oval eyes and push-pull hair. Heather, her eyebrows as thick as felt erasers, and joy whose lips performed the perfect ode to space. And within their universe of shattered glass, the birthday girl herself had drawn upon her form new breasts, two white planets on the simple A-line dress. Yet her mouth was as short as fate, as straight as time. Only her eyes, two ova, were a childlike rhyme. Have you ever tried to write a poem in which the scene was so dramatic or overpowering that the language just couldn't do what you remember seeing and hearing? Well, if you have, this is one of these poems, and I'm not sure yet whether it works. So I'm going to have to let some of you out there tell me if you think it does. It's called Moving. A man with barbed wire tattoos has just thrown a mirror into a pickup's box, splintering his rage. With slivered eyes, he's screaming, "I told you the damn thing wouldn't fit into the truck." While a woman standing in the hellhole of their garage is clinging to a wicker piece as if it were a child. Above them, sparrows are coupling in the sun, then taking off for nesting places, one by one. And here's another one of my favorites. This was a girl who, she had bruises, usually had bruises on her face. I don't know how many times I came close to calling the police and saying, go down to this corner and see if you can find this girl and find out what's happening to her. And yet, I watched the kids in that neighborhood play it so often that I knew they were roughnecks. Even the girls were roughnecks. And so they were always skinned up, and they were always bruised. But she sold Koolaid. And so the hottest days, she'd be there on the corner, sitting in the weeds by the lamppost with her Koolaid pitcher. And so she had these little paper cups, and she sold Koolaid for 10 cents a cup. So I would always buy a cup and give her $1. So it was an 80-cent tip for a 10-cent cup of Kool-Aid. And I remember the first time, how can you forget things like this? I remember the first time I did this, and I drank the Kool-Aid, and I got about half or 3/4 of a block away, and here she yelled out after me, "Thanks, mister." And hotter than all get out that day, and I think I was cool all the way home, 2.5 miles home. I was just cool because that was a really great thing for her to say. So I bought quite a few cups of Kool-Aid for $1 from her. Well, one day I did this, and I was walking back over the railroad tracks, and there are some of you here who know Kearney well enough, and I got from the south side to the north, the affluent north side. And I found a boy who was selling Kool-Aid. And I still had, 3/4 of a mile to go to until I got home, so I decided, I need another cup of Kool-Aid. So I said, I need a cup of Kool-Aid. How much are you selling it for? 35 cents a cup. Well, I knew I was on the affluent north side. I was at 10 cents a cup on the south side, 35 cents a cup on the north side. So I said, okay, I'll have a cup, thinking to myself, you're only going to get a 65-cent tip. Huh? So he poured me a cup of Kool-Aid, and I looked at it, and he must have noticed that I was looking at it. He probably thought I was looking at it quizzically. I was just delaying a minute before I drank it, and he said, would you like 1 cube or 2? And I thought, whoa, this is really something. I said, I'll take 2 because I have quite a ways to go until I get home. And so we put 2 cubes in. We've got a little ice bucket out from underneath his cardboard table, and gave me 2 cubes, and I was looking at it, and he said, would you like a little umbrella in that? And I said, no. I said, don't know what I would do with it. Besides, you can keep it for your next customer. But the battered girl didn't have any cubes. She just had 2 or 3 swimming around in a big pitcher. And they usually were long since melted, and she certainly didn't have any little young umbrellas. But boy, did she have a smile. She really had a smile. So this is for the battered girl who always said hello. Emerging from the fist of your house, your smile came at me like a sparkler through the weeds. Even in August, when the elephant ears of the rhubarb fainted, even in that alley where the backbones of old nails scabbed up in rust. Near the garbage can, a fuse of orange traveled from your tongue, like a lily in that alley. 1. The older people in that part of town, many of whom are from Eastern European descent, have remarkable gardens. They garden the way people really should garden. I think I say in the short preface to this book of poems that these people tend to their gardens with an old world zeal. But the young seem to anger all their pleasures. And so there's a dramatic difference not only between houses in which there are cannas growing and houses in which backyards are filled up with disposable diapers, but there's a dramatic difference between the old people and the young people. And so I decided to finish this group of poems by reading 3 poems about old people. 2 are poets of gardens, and one old man is a poet of fence fixing. And this is called The Man with a Garden for a Yard. The man with a garden for a yard stands on his porch, his eyes growing squash, the air ripe with melons. It's early March, but even his terrace has been plowed and raked, each clod pulverized by love. As time winds through his fence near the bird bath, new straw bales gleam like ingots in the sun. Checking his watch, he looks out through his screen. Dirt begins to tendril like a dream. Have you ever seen houses like this in which the whole front yard is just plowed up into a garden? This guy he's miraculous. I mean, he can grow anything. I mean, his onions grow 5 feet tall. Yeah. Plus the fact, Robin, he's a connoisseur of martins. He's got 7 martin houses in his front yard. And so if I weren't looking at the martins, I was looking at the garden. And old Slovak. There's an old Slovakian woman. Yeah. He told me in no uncertain terms one day, she said, "I'm not a Czech, I'm a Slovak. There's a big difference." And I said, "I won't quarrel with you." I just won't quarrel with you. Old Slovak. In the weeds at the end of her lot, an old woman is letting her gnarled fingers caress a gnarled hoe. Taking it slow, she's remembering every rhythm of pull, bringing herself up to the handle. As she's unfolding from herself the right number of rows, they're no more or less than the palpable guess she's scratched from the ears. Her gray bonnet halos her face, her hose flap like loose flesh in the wind. In her palm, the pinched lives of the lettuce, which she'll drop like the lives of small angels into a world of immaculate rose. And this old man, I don't think I ever learned his name. I talked to him very many times, but he lived out at the edge of Kearney. And he's got probably about 3/4 of a block, in parts of which he runs 3 sheep, and he's got an old mangy horse. But he's always fixing fence. And the fence reminds me of the barbed wire that I helped my grandmother with at the end of the 1930s. I mean, it's just rotten barbed wire. And he's always trying to pull it tight, and it's always breaking. And for those of you who've ever tried to do this, you try to do that, and the barbed wire always finds you. I mean, it just finds you. And one day I looked at the back of his hands, and they were just all scarred up where this wire had bitten into him. But that didn't prevent him from trying to make that fence as tight as he could possibly make it. And certainly there's got to be not only a metaphor there, but a symbol that just rolls on and out into so many different lives. At the edge of town, hard to know which is more gnarled, the posts he hammers staples into, or the blue hummocks which run across his hands like moles. Work has reduced his wrists to bones, cut out of him the easy flesh, and brought him down to this, the crowbar's teeth caught just behind a barb. Again this morning the crowbar's neck will make its blue slip into wood. There will be that moment when too much strength will cause the wire to break. But even at 70, he says, he has to have it right, and more than right. This morning, in the pewter light, he has the scars to prove it. The last 2 poems I'm going to read are, as I said, very, very different poems. The first one is a war poem. War poems, I think, are always risky to write. If you know what you want to say before you begin the poem too often ends up as polemic, or even worse, as a piece of propaganda. And if the emotion of the poem overrides the sense of it, then the poem turns into a rant or a screed. So I don't think we have very many good war poems, and that's a really risky way to introduce a war poem. But if you want to read good war poems, go back to the war poets of World War I and read Rupert Brooke and Wilfred Owen. So what I've tried to do in this particular poem is to reduce it to one soldier and let him give you his observation and also let him talk aloud. The poem is entitled "In a Time of Considerable Wars," and it's written in parts, the first one of which is called "The Corporal." As he dies, his shadow lying beside him is a good dog. The sun, still in love with his body, as it's always done, extending his life. In the dry light, the liquid rose on his chest is a memorial to his dead lung, while his shadow which has never given birth to itself, which has only mimicked the words of his mouth, is a bloom, part of the still life of this long afternoon. 2, for those in the lame man platoon. Yesterday, your other eyes looked back at you from their parallel worlds, back from their rivers of silence. You stood with them on the banks of your deaths. They did not blink. They were not measured by clocks. If they were fortunate enough to age like clear panes, there was about them the fragrance of space and the endlessness of good windows. It was no mistake they were born. Their tears were faint periods in the books of the faithful. 3, overcast. No limb stirs. The trees loom space. In this gauzy absence, nothing's a lead knowing. So begins another week of wrapped up hatred, its past and future forcing our presence out the door. Down mud steps, past 2 corpses, faceless, the air around their shoulders unlived in, as before. 4, in this hole in the earth. In this hole in the earth, I am reading your letter. It is a soft hand, a good snow, a bird filled with forests. Because you are who you are and I am a soldier, I thank you for not taking my real self out of your dreams. Remember when I told you there would always be wars, that we simply hoped they weren't ours? Now from my living grave in this earth, I hear fanatics thrashing their nerves into screams. On their chests are rows and rows of black medals. I once again open your letter. I am walking the coastline of history. There is a blue wind behind me. I am barefoot on your irreducible shore. 5, new snow. I shall look up at the sun until I find the face of it cloudless. I shall reflect upon the eruptions of its considerable anger. I am small, no more than a sound in a storm, no more intricate than my beginnings. For what was I born? From whose womb was I uttered to be a kiss among scars, a suffix of suffer? They say heat rises. I shall try to go up. I shall try to make every effort to know me. I must be considerate in a time of considerable wars. I don't want to leave you with that. Thank you for saying thank you. So I'm going to read you a poem about my granddaughter, almost 3. At the Welch household, we play a game in the backyard called the feather game. Now, the backyard is filled with 60 racing pigeons, all of whom contribute and have contributed to the feather game. Because as they drop down feathers, what I do with my granddaughters, all of them, and grandsons too, but the granddaughters seem to hang in there with me on this game longer than the grandsons do. So half of the 15, more than half of the 15, come out there and we wait until we have a reasonably breezy day, and then I take a down feather and put it on the end of my finger and I blow it up into the air. And if you're 1 to 4, you chase that down feather around the backyard until you catch it. And so we've got grandkids going every which way, you know, sometimes colliding, but usually it's best when we just have one at a time. And the air is just right to keep that down feather 2 feet above their heads. You know the longest time that a grandchild, daughter, has ever spent trying to get one of these suckers? 20 minutes. We've got a little, you know, kind of a little whirlwind that goes around there, and so the thing can't escape. But then when you become 4, then the game really becomes a good game. Because you can't catch the down feather with your hand, you have to catch it on the end of your nose. Oh, wow. You know, it's a good thing little kids have workable cervical vertebra, because we've had kids running around there for minutes, you know, with their heads pointed up, trying to get this doggone down feather on their nose. Well, anyway, I decided that for one of them, that I would write this poem for her. So this is called To My Granddaughter, Almost 3, to be read on her 31st birthday. Yep. In your sandbox, I loved the way the cups we offered to the heavens simply filled themselves up. And your dances after baths, when your shaken bake left no cheek out to chance. I loved your pouts, the way you squinched your eyeballs until they became arguments with roots, or mad you gummed up clocks, or glad you made time scoot. So what can we tell the world? That there's nothing better than sharing Tootsie Pops with dogs? That at bedtime, running buck naked from our mothers, we can produce slipstreams of pure glee? Or that after we've skinned our knees and the pains repealed, we can fill our throats with birds? Sincerely, your grandfather, who's gone into the dirt, but not out of the world, who's out there now near the bird bath, keeping the literal spiritual. So it isn't a question of whether I'm going to be out by the bird bath. It's a question of whether she believes I'm out there by the bird bath. So that's where we started, talking about keeping the literal spiritual, and that's where we're going to end. Thank you so much for coming.